11,000 years ago, before agriculture, before writing, before a single permanent village existed anywhere on Earth, a group of hunter gatherers did something that shouldn't have been possible. They quarried, carved, and raised massive stone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, arranged in careful circles, decorated with animal carvings. No one lived there permanently. There were no farms nearby to feed the workers. And yet, somehow, scattered bands of foragers organized themselves well enough to build a monument that predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. That site is called Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, and it might be the oldest religious structure ever discovered. It forces us to ask a strange question. Why would people with no writing, no cities, and barely any surplus food spend enormous effort building something for gods they couldn't see? To understand that, we have to go back further, to the actual beginning of religious thought, deep in the Stone Age, long before anything resembling a temple existed. The earliest evidence isn't a building, it's a body. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, archaeologists have found Neanderthal burials, bodies deliberately placed in the earth, in some cases arranged with apparent care, occasionally alongside stone tools, or, according to some contested analyses, pollen suggesting flowers. Whether Neanderthals held genuine spiritual beliefs is still debated. But even setting them aside, Homo sapiens was doing something remarkable by around 100,000 years ago, deliberately burying the dead, sometimes with red ochre pigment covering the body, sometimes with shell jewelry. That detail, the ochre, turns out to matter enormously. Red ochre isn't functional. It doesn't help you hunt, doesn't help you survive winter, doesn't fill your stomach. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found deliberately engraved pieces of ochre dating back roughly 70,000 years, along with what appear to be the earliest known symbolic art objects in human history. Someone sat down, 70,000 years ago, and carved an abstract geometric pattern into a rock for no practical reason whatsoever. That's not survival behavior. That's something closer to meaning-making. So what was actually happening psychologically inside the minds of these early humans? Researchers point to a cognitive shift often called the emergence of theory of mind, the ability to understand that other beings have their own internal thoughts and intentions, separate from your own. Once early humans had this ability robustly, it appears to have generalized almost automatically. If your fellow humans have hidden intentions and unseen minds, why wouldn't the wind, the animals you hunted, the storms that could kill you without warning? This tendency has a name in cognitive science: hyperactive agency detection. Our ancestors' brains were wired to assume unexplained events had an intentional cause behind them, because assuming a rustling bush was a predator, even when it usually wasn't, kept you alive far more often than assuming it was just the wind. That single cognitive bias, according to many researchers, may be the psychological seed of virtually all religious thinking. A world full of invisible intentions, agencies, and minds behind natural events isn't a strange leap for a brain built this way. It's almost the default assumption. Then there's death itself, which may be the single most powerful driver of early religious thought. Humans are, as far as we know, the only species fully aware of our own mortality. Aware not just that death happens, but that it will happen to us personally. That awareness is a genuinely heavy psychological burden, and multiple researchers, drawing on what's called terror management theory, argue that religious belief systems emerged partly as a direct response to that unbearable knowledge. A belief in an afterlife, in ancestor spirits, in some continuation beyond physical death, doesn't just comfort the dying. It restructures how the living experience the passage of time, making mortality survivable as a daily psychological fact rather than a constant paralyzing terror. But there's a second explanation researchers increasingly think worked alongside the psychological one: religion as social technology. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar has argued that shared ritual and belief functioned as a kind of social glue, allowing early human groups to grow larger and cooperate more effectively than groups held together by kinship alone. If everyone in your band believes in the same unseen forces and fears the same consequences for betrayal, you've built a trust network that scales far beyond people who simply know each other personally. A belief in watching, judging supernatural forces, the sense that something is always observing your behavior, made large scale cooperation with strangers dramatically easier to sustain. This is where Göbekli Tepe becomes genuinely fascinating again, because it sits at exactly the hinge point of this theory. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavation for decades, proposed something that inverted the traditional story of civilization. The old assumption was agriculture came first, allowing settled villages, which eventually built temples once there was enough surplus food to support religious labor. Göbekli Tepe suggests almost the opposite. It was built by hunter-gatherers before agriculture existed in that region at all. Some researchers now argue that the desire to gather periodically for shared ritual may have been part of what actually drove the transition towards settled life and farming, not the other way around. Feeding large ritual gatherings repeatedly may have nudged some communities toward deliberately cultivating grain nearby. If that sequence is even partly correct, it means something remarkable. Religion may not be a byproduct of civilization. Civilization may be, in part, a byproduct of religion. None of this means early religious belief was simple or uniform. Cave art at sites like Chauvet and Lascaux in France, dating back over 30,000 years, shows elaborate animal figures deep in cave chambers that would have required deliberate, difficult, torch-lit journeys to reach. Chambers far too dangerous and inconvenient for casual use. Many researchers interpret these deep cave sanctuaries as ritual or shamanic spaces, possibly connected to trance states, animal spirit beliefs, or coming-of-age ceremonies. We'll likely never know the exact stories these early humans told themselves, but the deliberate effort involved tells us these weren't casual decorations. Someone believed reaching that specific, dangerous, hidden place mattered enough to justify real risk. So when you put all of this together, the ochre-covered burials, the hyperactive pattern recognition wired into our brains, the psychological need to manage the terror of mortality, the social bonding advantage of shared belief, and finally monuments like Göbekli Tepe, built before farming even existed, a picture starts to emerge that's very different from the old assumption that religion was simply invented later, once humans had the leisure time to think about it. Religion, or at least its cognitive and emotional foundations, appears to be almost as old as fully modern human thought itself. Not a layer added on top of civilization, but quite possibly one of the forces that helped build civilization in the first place. Our ancestors weren't primitive people slowly stumbling toward belief as an afterthought. They may have needed it, psychologically and socially, from nearly the very beginning of what it means to think like a human being at all. If you liked this video, like and subscribe for more.